It's a quiet November night in Moscow, Idaho. The streets are lined with fallen leaves, and the hum of campus life is winding down. Inside a house just off campus, 6 college students are spending what should have been an ordinary evening. Some are preparing for bed, others catching up on the events of their day. Hours later, 4 of them would be found brutally murdered. The nation would wake to headlines describing a crime so shocking it would leave even the most seasoned investigators grasping for answers. In the days that followed, confusion swept across this small college town. Who could have committed such a horrific act? Why this house? Why these students? As detectives pieced together the story, their investigation took them into the mind of a man whose life seemed, on the surface, unremarkable. A PhD student in criminology who had spent years studying crime. But as the puzzle unfolded, his name would emerge as the suspect in a case that has captivated and haunted the country ever since. Tonight, we examine the details of what happened in that house, the evidence that led to Bradley Kohberger's arrest, and the questions that remain unanswered. This is the story of 4 young lives cut tragically short, and the trial of the man accused of ending them. Moscow, Idaho, a town defined by its peace, charm, and community spirit. Nestled in the Palouse region of the Pacific Northwest, Moscow was home to about 25,000 residents, with a sizable portion of them being students at the University of Idaho. It was a place where everyone knew everyone. A place where the sense of security was as palpable as the cool air in November. Yet on November 13, 2022, that sense of calm was shattered forever. The 4 victims, Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, had been living their lives, each with their own bright future ahead. Their stories, like many of their peers, were filled with promise and excitement. Kaylee and Madison had formed a bond that few friendships could match. Raised in small towns not far from each other, they shared more than just their years at the University of Idaho. Their bond had been forged over shared memories, growing up together, navigating the ups and downs of adolescence, and supporting each other through the challenges of college life. It's said that true friendships don't just exist in good times. They're proven in moments of hardship. And for Kaylee and Maddie, their friendship had been through it all. Kaylee, a driven young woman, had always been an achiever. As a senior, she was on track to graduate early, and her future plans were already taking shape. She had recently secured a job offer in Austin, Texas, and had big dreams of relocating there to begin a new chapter. Her parents described her as fiercely independent, someone who had always worked hard for everything she wanted. Her best friend, Madison Mogen, was equally driven, though her path was slightly different. Maddie was an outgoing and charismatic individual, known for her sense of humor and infectious laughter. She had dreams of working in the food industry, a passion she nurtured during her time in college. Whether it was making people smile with her jokes or her bubbly personality, Maddie was the kind of person who could light up a room. Xana Kernodle was known for her vivacity and her ability to connect with everyone she met. She wasn't one to blend in. Rather, she was someone who stood out. Xana was a junior marketing student, well-liked by her peers and faculty. She was dating Ethan Chapin, a freshman who had made the decision to attend the University of Idaho because of his love for the outdoors and sports. He was a triplet, and his siblings were his best friends, a bond that was unshakable. The house at 1122 King Road was a common living arrangement for students at the university. It was situated on a quiet street in Moscow, away from the bustle of campus, but close enough to be convenient. The layout of the house was typical. A large 3-story structure with 6 bedrooms, a communal living area, and a kitchen. The 2 surviving roommates, who were also university students, lived on the first floor. On the night of November 12th, the house was full of life, as the students settled into their weekend routine. Kaylee and Maddie had spent the evening at the Corner Club, a local bar known for its relaxed atmosphere and college crowd. Surveillance footage from the bar shows the 2 friends laughing, their faces lighting up in smiles as they shared fries and a late-night snack. It's a brief but significant moment captured on camera, one that seemed ordinary at the time but would later be replayed over and over in the media, their last known footage before the tragedy. Xana and Ethan, meanwhile, had attended a party at the Sigma Chi fraternity house. It was a typical college gathering with music, dancing, and conversation. Ethan, who had just begun his college journey, was enjoying his first few months at the University of Idaho and loved spending time with Xana. The couple's relationship was a source of happiness and stability for both of them, and those who knew them spoke of their deep connection and mutual respect. By 2 a.m., they returned to the house on King Road, a short distance from the party. The other roommates, who were not involved in the attack, had been asleep by this point. The time frame of the attack remains unclear, but investigators believe it occurred sometime between 4 and 4:25 a.m. As the clock ticked toward the early morning hours, the house's once vibrant atmosphere gave way to violence. The police report the first call came at 11:58 a.m. A roommate, whose identity has been protected, dialed 911, reporting an unconscious person at the residence. The dispatcher, unsure of the severity, dispatched officers immediately. When police arrived on the scene, they were met with a gruesome sight. The crime scene itself was something out of a nightmare. Blood spattered the walls of the second and third floors, where Kaylee, Maddie, Xana, and Ethan had been. In one of the bedrooms, the bodies were discovered, each victim covered in stab wounds. The horror was not just in the brutality of the crime, but in the cold, calculated nature with which it was carried out. The knife used was a fixed blade, a weapon that left no room for doubt about the level of violence involved. At first, investigators believed the crime might have been a burglary gone wrong. But as the details emerged, it became clear that this was no random act of violence. The two surviving roommates, who had been on the first floor, were spared. They were unharmed physically, though they were deeply shaken by the events that had transpired. Their testimony became crucial to the investigation, but their experience, too, raised more questions. How had they slept through such a violent crime unfolding just above them? Why had they not heard anything? These were the details investigators needed to piece together in order to build a case. The investigation took on a life of its own. With every passing day, the pressure mounted. Media outlets clamored for updates. The families of the victims demanded answers, but law enforcement officials remained tight-lipped. The small town of Moscow had never experienced anything like this, and people began to question their safety. Why would someone do this? How could this have happened here, in such a peaceful place? For weeks, the investigation seemed to stall. No arrests, no clear suspects. The uncertainty only deepened as the investigation progressed. But behind the scenes, detectives were hard at work, following leads, reviewing evidence, and piecing together the fragments of a larger puzzle. And then a break came. Authorities, aware that the killer might be someone familiar with the area, began combing through surveillance footage. They identified a white Hyundai Elantra, which was seen near the King Road house on the night of the murders. Investigators began to track the car, and soon they found a match. Bradley Kohberger, a criminology PhD student at Washington State University, just across the border in Pullman, Washington. Kohberger's connection to the case was striking. He had been studying criminal justice, focusing on the psychology of criminals and law enforcement practices. His academic interests seemed to have aligned closely with the motivations of the killer. At first, his connection to the crime appeared to be circumstantial, until DNA evidence tied him to the scene. A sheath of a knife was found near one of the victims' bodies. It was a crucial piece of evidence. DNA recovered from the sheath was eventually matched to Bradley Kohberger. The investigators now had their suspect. The arrest of Kohberger came as a shock to those who knew him. He was described as quiet and studious, not someone who would have appeared on anyone's radar as a potential killer. His classmates spoke of his deep interest in criminal psychology, his questions about law enforcement procedures, and his research into the minds of criminals. But those who had interacted with him in the past also recalled oddities: his habit of staring too long at people, his cold demeanor in certain situations. Was Kohberger a man consumed by his academic studies, or was there something darker beneath the surface? This would be the key question going forward. As the world awaited his trial, the case remained in the public eye. The arrest of Bradley Kohberger did not answer all the questions. His motive, his connection to the victims, and his role in the crime would soon become the focus of legal proceedings. Today, we begin to unpack the details of the investigation, the evidence, the suspects, the theories, and try to understand what led to the tragic deaths of Kaylee, Maddie, Xana, and Ethan. Initial investigation on November 13, 2022, the town of Moscow, Idaho, would never be the same. The first real clues to the horrific events of the previous night came not from the police, but from one of the surviving roommates. In the late morning around 11:58 a.m., the surviving roommate, who had been on the first floor of the King Road house the night before, made the fateful 911 call. They reported an unconscious person, which would be the first indication that something was terribly wrong. At the time, there was no way for law enforcement to know just how much darker the scene would be. The roommate, who had woken up and noticed a strange and unsettling feeling in the house, had gone to check on their friends. They had found one of the victims unresponsive. The response was panic-stricken and confused, not yet comprehending the full scale of the tragedy. The 911 call itself would later become a topic of scrutiny. Within minutes, officers arrived on the scene. What they found inside the home was nothing short of horrifying. As they entered, it became immediately clear that this was not a case of a single victim or a simple medical emergency. The house had been turned into a crime scene of unimaginable brutality. On the second floor of the home, they discovered the bodies of Kaylee Gonkovs and Madison Mogan, two college students who had been friends since childhood. They had been brutally attacked in their sleep, their lives cut short by a savage and merciless act. Their blood was visible on the walls, suggesting that they had fought for their lives. On the third floor, investigators discovered Xana Kernodle and her boyfriend, Ethan Chapin. Like Kaylee and Maddie, they too had been attacked in the night. Blood spattered across the walls and floors of their bedrooms painted a terrifying picture of the violence that had taken place. A sheath of a fixed-blade knife left at the scene of the crime became one of the most significant pieces of evidence found in the immediate aftermath. The crime scene itself was chaotic. Evidence was scattered throughout the house. Blood stained the walls, the floors, and the bedding. Investigators later determined that the stabbings had occurred during the early morning hours, but the exact timeline remained uncertain. The details of the crime scene were so brutal that even seasoned detectives would later describe the experience as harrowing. It was clear that whoever had committed this act was not just driven by violence, but by something more calculated, something chilling. What shocked investigators further was the lack of apparent struggle in some of the rooms. There was no sign of forced entry, and in certain areas, the victims appeared to have been attacked while asleep. Some victims showed defensive wounds, suggesting they had attempted to fight back, but the brutality of the attacks left little room for survival. At first, Moscow's police department was blindsided by the severity of the crime. In a town where major crimes were few and far between, the scale of the tragedy was overwhelming. Police had no idea that just hours earlier, a brutal and calculated act of violence had unfolded in a quiet college town. Initially, law enforcement assumed it was a targeted attack, though this would not be confirmed for weeks. The police quickly secured the crime scene, shutting down access to the King Road house and beginning the grim work of processing the evidence. Forensic teams, homicide investigators, and crime scene analysts arrived, and what followed was a methodical, painstaking effort to gather every possible clue from the scene. Samples were taken: blood, DNA, fibers, all of which would later play a crucial role in the investigation. Though the police initially treated the crime scene as a potential burglary gone wrong, the lack of forced entry and the violence of the crime suggested a much darker possibility. The authorities were left scrambling to make sense of it all. The first few hours were spent gathering evidence from inside the home, while outside, the news began to spread like wildfire. The public was unaware of the specific details, but rumors quickly began circulating. As news of the murders spread across the nation, a media frenzy erupted. National news outlets, local journalists, and social media users all turned their attention to Moscow, Idaho. The quiet university town had suddenly become a hotspot of intrigue, speculation, and fear. The question on everyone's mind was simple. Who could have committed such a heinous crime in such a peaceful place? Was there a serial killer on the loose? Was this an isolated incident? Could the town of Moscow, long known for its safety and tranquility, ever return to normal? As the investigation unfolded, Moscow became a town under siege by media cameras and reporters. The authorities were cautious, withholding details as they tried to piece together the truth. But the lack of information only fueled the media fire. Every new detail, no matter how small, was seized upon by journalists, further stoking public fears. The police, caught between the need for transparency and the desire to maintain the integrity of the investigation, remained tight-lipped. At the same time, the residents of Moscow were gripped by fear. Students were sent home early, parents pulled their children out of the town, and the once bustling campus of the University of Idaho felt eerily empty. The uncertainty surrounding the investigation made everyone feel vulnerable. Could the killer still be out there? Was the town safe? The number of law enforcement officers in Moscow swelled as the FBI and state authorities joined the investigation. Students, particularly those living near King Road, began questioning their safety, and many took to social media to express their fears and anxieties. Hashtags like #JusticeForKaylee and Maddie and Kaylee spread across Twitter and Instagram as people began to demand answers. Local vigil services were held in honor of the victims, but the anxiety in the air was palpable. People felt like there was no closure, only more questions with no immediate answers. The wait for justice seemed unbearable. It wasn't just the media that was in a frenzy. The police force was working around the clock to understand the motive, to find any clues that could lead them to the killer. But at that moment, the case felt like a cold blank canvas. There were no obvious suspects, and the police had no clear leads. As the days passed, speculation and theories began to swirl around the case. The lack of information from the police led many to wonder if they were hiding something, if there was a specific lead they were pursuing. As the weeks passed, it became clear that law enforcement had no immediate suspects, and this led to a range of possible theories. One of the first initial theories was that the murders had been a targeted attack. But why these particular students? Why had they been chosen? There were no signs of robbery, no motive that immediately stood out. The killings didn't seem to be driven by personal animosity toward the victims. Some speculated that the killer might have known at least one of the victims, but who could that be? The mystery only deepened. Investigators also began to look at the other students who lived in the house. Though by all accounts, they were quickly ruled out, their testimonies were crucial. They confirmed that there had been no signs of tension or conflict between the victims and anyone they interacted with regularly. Still, law enforcement considered all possibilities, including the idea that the murders might have been committed by someone unknown to the victims. A stranger? An opportunistic killer? It wasn't long before early suspects emerged from the pool of people who knew the victims. Friends, acquaintances, even ex-boyfriends. In particular, the boyfriend of one of the victims was initially a person of interest. However, he was quickly cleared of any involvement after further investigation. Rumors also circulated about a possible connection to the University of Idaho's Greek system, and theories about potential suspects within that community began to surface. But law enforcement refrained from commenting publicly on any leads, focusing instead on following the evidence. There was one constant. The lack of any clear suspect left people on edge, questioning who might be capable of committing such an act. As the days passed, frustration mounted. The victims' families were desperate for answers. The lack of transparency from law enforcement only added to their pain. Were the police any closer to finding the killer? Was anyone else at risk? But as the media continued to speculate and as public pressure mounted, one thing became increasingly clear. The investigation was far from over, and the answers that everyone had been waiting for were still just out of reach. Bradley Kohberger was born on November 21, 1994 in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, a small, relatively quiet town nestled in the Pocono Mountains. Growing up in a modest household, Kohberger's upbringing did not immediately hint at the tragic events that would later unfold. His family was described as typical in many ways, but underneath the surface, There were complexities that would later become relevant in understanding the man who would go on to become the central figure in a horrific crime. His father, Michael Kohberger, was an engineer, and his mother, Marianne, worked as a paraprofessional in the public school system. Brian was the youngest of 3 children, with an older brother and sister. The Kohberger family lived in a quiet neighborhood, a place where children were often seen playing outside, and families had long-standing roots in the community. On the surface, Brian's childhood seemed unremarkable, but closer examination reveals a young man who struggled with certain aspects of his personality that would later become pivotal. From an early age, Kohberger displayed signs of being a bit of an outsider. Although academically gifted, he struggled socially, often finding it difficult to connect with peers. As a child, he was reportedly shy and introverted, preferring the company of books over playdates. He excelled in school, but his academic success did little to shield him from the isolation he felt. The difficulty in making friends was something Kohberger would carry with him throughout his life, eventually contributing to his intense focus on criminology as he sought to understand human behavior, specifically the behavior of those who operated outside societal norms. His parents, while loving, were not overly attentive to the emotional challenges Brian faced, perhaps due to their own busy careers. He had a tendency to internalize his struggles, which may have left him feeling alienated. As he grew older, this sense of alienation transformed into a fascination with criminal behavior, something that would come to define much of his later years. Brian Kohberger was known to be intensely focused on his studies, particularly in the areas of psychology and criminology. His intellectual curiosity about criminal minds was more than just an academic pursuit. It seemed to be a personal obsession. Kohberger's classmates and professors at DeSales University, where he completed his undergraduate degree, noted his unusual level of commitment to understanding the psychology behind violent criminals. However, it was not merely an academic interest. There was a darker edge to his fascination. Kohberger was often described as someone who was hard to get to know, maintaining a sense of emotional distance from others. He was not particularly engaging in social settings, preferring to spend time reading, studying, and reflecting on his research. Some of his classmates found him to be somewhat aloof, not in a cruel or malicious way, but in a manner that suggested emotional detachment. His peers recalled his tendency to steer conversations towards criminal topics, often speaking at length about various cases of murder and violence, even when others weren't interested. This behavior was unsettling to some, especially when his discussions lacked any hint of empathy for the victims involved. During his time at DeSales, Kohberger became increasingly fixated on the psychology of criminal behavior. He was particularly drawn to the study of violent offenders, criminals who committed heinous acts without apparent remorse. His professors began to notice an intensity in his research that set him apart from his classmates. Kohberger's academic pursuits weren't merely about understanding crime. There was an element of personal obsession that seemed to drive his studies. Kohberger's isolation and lack of social connection may have made it easier for him to fixate on criminal psychology. Without strong emotional ties to friends or family, he immersed himself fully in the world of criminology, exploring theories about murderers, serial killers, and psychopaths. His lack of empathy for the victims in his academic studies raised red flags for some of his professors, though nothing definitive surfaced during his undergraduate years that would have led them to suspect that his interest in criminology would one day manifest in such a horrifying way. Brian Kohberger's decision to pursue criminology was not made on a whim. It was the result of years of introspection and a deep-seated desire to understand the darker aspects of human nature. His academic journey began at DeSales University, where he earned a degree in criminal justice. Kohberger's work during this time was primarily focused on the psychological profiles of violent offenders. His passion for criminology wasn't just about studying the theories. It was about understanding why people commit violent acts, what makes them tick, and how their minds work. During his undergraduate studies, Kohberger's fascination with the psychological aspects of violent crimes, particularly those committed by serial killers, began to grow more pronounced. He became captivated by notorious criminals such as Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and others who had committed heinous murders. He studied them with a level of detail that bordered on obsession, devoting hours to reading books, articles, and police reports about their crimes. This intense academic focus on violent behavior seemed to be a way for Kohberger to not only satisfy his intellectual curiosity, but also to try to understand something about himself. After completing his undergraduate degree, Kohberger pursued graduate studies at Washington State University, where he continued his criminology research. It was during this period that he began to gravitate toward a more disturbing aspect of criminology, the idea of understanding murderers from within, studying their minds in a more personal and in-depth manner. His academic work seemed to shift towards a desire to analyze crimes in a way that was both intellectual and, at times, disturbingly detached from the human cost of those crimes. Kohberger's professors and colleagues noted his thoroughness and intelligence, but there were whispers of his obsession with the violence that his field of study often touched upon. As Kohberger advanced in his studies, he became increasingly isolated from his peers. While some of his colleagues developed close relationships and engaged in social activities, Kohberger remained largely alone. His immersion in criminology and his fixation on violent crimes led him to create a world where he was not just a student of crime, but at times seemingly a passive observer, detached from the reality of the consequences of violence. Kohberger's online activity was perhaps the most troubling aspect of his personality. Throughout his time as a graduate student, he maintained a presence on Reddit, where he would often engage in discussions about criminology and criminal justice. His posts, under the username Criminology for All, revealed a mind fixated on the nature of violent crime. He participated in threads about unsolved murders, discussed the psychological profiles of famous killers, and offered his own theories about why people commit such horrific acts. What stood out about Kohberger's online behavior was the cold, detached tone he often used when discussing murder. While many Reddit users in these threads were discussing the horrors of crime with empathy or a sense of moral outrage, Kohberger's contributions were clinical, academic, and at times unnervingly cold. His responses to other users' theories often displayed a chilling lack of empathy for the victims. His fascination with crime appeared to cross a line from intellectual curiosity to something much darker, and some users in these threads began to take notice of his disconcerting attitude. Kohberger's activity on Reddit was not limited to just academic discussions. He also engaged in more personal interactions with others who shared his interest in criminology. In these exchanges, Kohberger often expressed frustration with his inability to connect with people on a deeper level. His social isolation was evident in these posts, where he revealed how difficult he found it to form meaningful relationships. Some of his posts seemed to hint at a yearning for recognition or understanding, particularly in relation to his academic work and his intense interest in criminal psychology. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Kohberger's online presence was his fascination with the victims of violent crimes. He often searched for details about unsolved murders, even cases that were far removed from his immediate studies. This obsessive behavior, combined with his cold, detached attitude toward the victims, painted a disturbing picture of a man whose interest in criminology had evolved into something far more unsettling. The connection between Brian Kohberger and the victims of the Idaho murders became clearer as investigators delved deeper in his background and his movements leading up to the killings. In the early days of the investigation, law enforcement was unsure whether the crime was random or targeted. They had no immediate suspects, and there were no signs of forced entry into the King Road house, which led many to believe that the killer might have known the victims. As investigators pieced together surveillance footage, cell phone data, and interviews with witnesses, a pattern began to emerge that pointed toward Kohberger. His car was captured on surveillance cameras near the scene of the crime multiple times in the days leading up to the murders, and his cell phone data placed him within a short distance of the house at the time of the killings. This information, combined with the chilling details about Kohberger's background and his unsettling online activity, led investigators to begin looking more closely at him as a potential suspect. The connection between Kohberger and the victims was not immediately apparent. There was no evidence suggesting that he knew them personally or had any direct interactions with them. However, as investigators continued to examine his movements and behaviors, it became clear that he had been observing them in the days leading up to the murders. This raised disturbing questions about whether Kohberger had targeted them specifically, or if they were simply the unfortunate victims of his growing obsession with violent crime. Some theorists suggest that Kohberger may have been drawn to the victims because of their carefree college lifestyle, something that he may have envied but never fully understood. Others believe that he may have seen the murders as an opportunity to test his theories about violent crime, to put his academic knowledge into practice. Whatever his motives, the chilling truth was that Brian Kohberger had somehow become the man responsible for one of the most horrific crimes in recent memory. The investigation into the brutal murders of Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin had been slow, mired in confusion and uncertainty. For weeks, the Moscow Police Department had been stymied by the lack of solid leads. Though the crime scene was undeniably brutal, there were no obvious clues pointing toward a suspect. No weapon was found, no apparent motive was discovered, and no clear connection between the victims and any potential assailant emerged. However, as the investigation dragged on, it was a single piece of evidence that would change everything: DNA. The crime scene was meticulously combed by forensic investigators who began collecting every trace of evidence that could provide insight into the identity of the killer. Blood splatters, fingerprints, and other potential traces of the murderer were analyzed with the most advanced forensic techniques available. Amidst all this, forensic scientists uncovered a crucial piece of evidence: a sheath from a fixed-blade knife found lying next to the body of one of the victims. At first glance, it appeared to be a minor detail, but it turned out to be a game-changer. Forensic testing revealed that DNA had been left on the knife sheath. While it was not an unusual finding for investigators to collect traces of bodily fluids or skin cells from a crime scene, the fact that DNA from the sheath was linked to an individual made this discovery monumental. In the absence of witnesses or an immediate lead, DNA evidence became the pivotal point that would allow law enforcement to make a connection between the crime scene and a suspect. The DNA from the sheath was processed, and investigators quickly ran the genetic information through various databases. What they found was astounding. The DNA linked back to Brian Kohberger, a criminology student from Pennsylvania, who was already known to be a graduate student at Washington State University, just a short distance from Moscow, Idaho. It was a stunning revelation, especially considering that Kohberger had no obvious direct connection to the victims. This DNA match provided investigators with the critical lead they had been desperately seeking. The next logical step was to gather more information and build a clearer picture of Kohberger's involvement in the crime. What followed would involve an intense scrutiny of his movements, his cell phone data, and the role of surveillance footage that would put the final pieces of the puzzle together. The breakthrough with DNA evidence set the stage for investigators to dive deeper into Brian Kohberger's movements leading up to the murders. They knew that a suspect's cell phone data could reveal an alarming amount of information, data that could shed light on where a suspect had been and when. This was an aspect of modern criminal investigations that had proven to be pivotal in countless other cases, and it would prove to be just as important in this one. Law enforcement began by analyzing Kohberger's cell phone records. They found that his phone had been active in the Moscow area on the night of the murders, coinciding with the estimated time frame in which the killings had taken place. As the investigators cross-referenced the data from Kohberger's phone with other pieces of evidence, such as the time of the murders and the location of the crime, they began to see a pattern emerge. Kohberger had been in close proximity to the victim's home during the night of the murders, and his movements matched the timeline of the killings almost precisely. More troubling still was the discovery that Kohberger's phone had been near the King Road house on multiple occasions in the days leading up to the murders. His phone's GPS data revealed that he had been in the vicinity of the victim's home not once, but several times over the course of the previous week. It wasn't clear if he had been stalking the victims or simply passing through the area, but the proximity was troubling. The investigators were left with one undeniable conclusion. Kohberger had been paying attention to the victims long before the murder itself. This level of detail was crucial to the case. It painted a clear picture of a man who had intentionally placed himself near the crime scene. It wasn't the first time someone had been tracked by their cell phone during an investigation, but the consistency and frequency of Kohberger's location data near the King Road house was enough to elevate him from a person of interest to a prime suspect. As investigators continued to gather evidence linking Bradley Kohberger to the crime, they turned their attention to another crucial piece of the puzzle: surveillance footage. In a time when security cameras are almost ubiquitous, video evidence can be invaluable in solving crimes. Investigators obtained video footage from various sources: local businesses, traffic cameras, and private home security systems. What they discovered would be the final, undeniable link between Kohberger and the murders. The footage revealed a white Hyundai Elantra driving in the vicinity of the King Road house at approximately the time of the murders. This car was not an ordinary vehicle. It stood out as one of the few cars that had been seen near the crime scene that night. The surveillance footage captured the car driving by the house multiple times in the early morning hours, just before and after the murders were believed to have occurred. Investigators quickly identified the car as being registered to Bradley Kohberger. The make, model, and year of the vehicle matched the description provided by multiple surveillance cameras, and further investigation confirmed that Kohberger was the owner. The presence of the car, combined with his DNA at the scene and his cell phone data linking him to the area, painted a clear and compelling case that Kohberger had been directly involved in the murders. The connection between Kohberger and the white Hyundai Elantra was especially damning. It wasn't a coincidence that his car was spotted near the crime scene. This was hard evidence that placed him in the immediate vicinity of the victims at the critical time. Surveillance footage from a variety of angles and sources made it clear that Kohberger's movements on the night of the murders were no accident. By the time investigators pieced together the crucial evidence, DNA, cell phone data, and surveillance footage, the case against Bradley Kohberger was undeniable. He was no longer just a person of interest. He was the prime suspect in the brutal murders of 4 innocent college students. Law enforcement, now with overwhelming evidence linking Kohberger to the crime, made the decision to arrest him. The arrest took place in the early hours of December 30th, 2022, at his family home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. Kohberger had been under surveillance for days, and law enforcement was certain that he was the man responsible for the murders. A team of FBI agents and local law enforcement officers executed the arrest, taking Kohberger into custody without incident. The fact that the arrest was made so far from the crime scene added another layer of intrigue to the case. Kohberger had managed to flee the area after the murders, but the relentless investigation had eventually tracked him down. The arrest sent shockwaves through both the local communities of Moscow, Idaho, and Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. In Moscow, the students and residents had been living in fear and uncertainty for weeks. The idea that a killer could have been living in their midst, someone who had once been a student at a neighboring university, was incomprehensible. Students, faculty, and families who had been closely following the case felt a sense of relief, though it was tempered by the realization of just how deep the horror ran. The college town of Moscow, once known for its quiet, peaceful atmosphere, was forever altered by the gruesome crime. In Albrightsville, Kohberger's arrest was met with disbelief by many who had known him growing up. Friends and neighbors who had interacted with him were stunned by the news. How could the seemingly quiet, reserved criminology student they had known be capable of such an act? The arrest, while not entirely unexpected, left a deep mark on the community, as people tried to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the alleged killer now in custody. The national media quickly latched onto the story, reporting on every new detail as it emerged. News outlets across the country covered Kohberger's arrest and the developments in the case, leading to a frenzy of speculation, rumors, and theories about his motives. Social media platforms exploded with discussions and debates about Kohberger's background, his studies in criminology, and the evidence against him. The media scrutiny placed intense pressure on law enforcement, who were now tasked with preparing for the trial and providing the public with the answers they had been waiting for. For the families of the victims, the arrest marked the beginning of a long and painful journey toward justice. While the arrest brought some sense of closure, the grief of losing their loved ones would never fade. The trial that would follow would be a public spectacle, a chance for the families to confront the man accused of ending their children's lives. The breakthrough in the case, made possible by DNA evidence, cell phone data, and surveillance footage, had turned the tide in a case that seemed destined to remain unsolved. The arrest of Bradley Kohberger, the criminology student who once sought to understand criminal behavior, had brought the case full circle. The question now was whether the truth behind the murders would be revealed in court, or whether the dark secrets of the crime would remain locked away forever. While the arrest of Bradley Kohberger was the culmination of months of painstaking investigation, the journey to that point was not without its challenges. As the trial of Bradley Kohberger began to take shape, the gravity of the charges against him was immediately apparent. Kohberger, a criminology PhD student at Washington State University, stood accused of the cold-blooded murder of 4 University of Idaho students, Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogan, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. These students, beloved by their peers and professors, had been brutally stabbed to death in the early hours of November 13, 2022, in their off-campus home on King Road in Moscow, Idaho. The charges levied against Kohberger were severe. 4 counts of first-degree murder, as well as 1 count of burglary for unlawfully entering the victim's home. The prosecution's case was built on several key pieces of compelling evidence, each of which linked Kohberger to the crime scene in ways that were difficult to deny. Among the most significant pieces of evidence was the DNA found on a knife sheath discovered near the victims' bodies. The DNA matched Kohberger's, a critical breakthrough that linked him directly to the crime scene. Law enforcement had also analyzed cell phone data that placed Kohberger in close proximity to the victim's home before and after the murders. His white Hyundai Elantra, a vehicle seen repeatedly near the scene, was traced using surveillance footage from cameras around Moscow. The accumulation of these facts formed a strong case against Kohberger, making the prosecution's job one of piecing together the timeline and establishing motive. The evidence provided the foundation for the prosecution's argument that Kohberger had meticulously planned and executed the murders, moving through the victim's home in the dead of night with a chilling precision. This was not a spur-of-the-moment act. Rather, the evidence painted a picture of someone who had carefully chosen his victims, possibly even stalked them beforehand. Another aspect of the case that added weight to the prosecution's claims was the meticulous nature of the crime itself. The stabbings were brutal, and no signs of forced entry into the home had been found. This led investigators to believe that the perpetrator had been known to the victims, and the ease with which he entered the residence further suggested a premeditated and deliberate attack. With the evidence against him stacking up, the prosecution would seek to establish that Kohberger's criminology background, his extensive studies in criminal behavior, indicated not only his knowledge of the human psyche, but also a possible understanding of how to evade detection. The theory was that Kohberger's studies might have played a role in his ability to plan and execute the murders without being immediately caught. His deep interest in criminology could have allowed him to think like a criminal, putting him in a position to elude capture for weeks. This gave the prosecution a psychological angle to their case, one that painted Kohberger not just as a killer, but as a calculating and methodical one. However, despite the strong evidence against Kohberger, one critical element remained uncertain: the motives. What drove a man so deeply immersed in studying criminal behavior to commit such a heinous crime? This question would remain a focal point of the trial, as the prosecution and defense would both try to piece together the motives for the attack. As with any high-profile criminal trial, the defense was quick to challenge the prosecution's evidence and cast doubt on its validity. Kohberger's legal team, led by a group of experienced attorneys, sought to create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jury, attempting to dismantle the strength of the case against their client. The first line of defense was likely to focus on the circumstantial nature of much of the evidence. While the DNA found on the knife sheath was a crucial link, the defense could argue that it did not necessarily prove Kohberger's direct involvement in the crime. The argument could be made that the presence of his DNA did not indicate that he had committed the murders, but that it was merely a result of his being in the area or having been involved in some unrelated interaction with the victims. This line of reasoning could raise enough questions about the reliability of DNA evidence in this case to create doubt among the jurors. The defense would also likely question the cell phone data. While the data suggested Kohberger's presence near the crime scene, there could be counter-arguments regarding the accuracy of location data, suggesting that it wasn't irrefutable proof of his involvement. The defense might propose alternative explanations, such as the possibility that Kohberger was in the vicinity for reasons unrelated to the crime, perhaps for an innocent reason that was unrelated to the murders themselves. Kohberger's phone could have been pinging off towers in a random pattern, they might argue, as he traveled through the area. Moreover, the defense could attack the notion that Kohberger's criminology background played a role in the murders. They could claim that his academic focus on criminal psychology didn't mean he would necessarily have the ability to carry out such a calculated crime. Kohberger might have been deeply interested in the study of crime from an academic perspective, but that didn't mean he was equipped to carry out a real-life murder. The defense could use Kohberger's background as an argument for his innocence rather than guilt, suggesting that his studies would have made him more likely to follow the law than to break it. The biggest challenge for the defense, however, would be dealing with the evidence from the Hyundai Elantra. The car's presence near the crime scene was a critical detail. Kohberger's attorneys could attempt to discredit the surveillance footage or argue that it wasn't conclusive enough to tie him to the murders. They might also present an alternative explanation for why his car was seen in the area, suggesting that there were other reasons for his presence in Moscow and the vicinity of the victim's home. The defense would also be likely to explore Kohberger's personal history, his mental health, and any signs of behavioral issues that could have influenced his actions. If they could provide any evidence suggesting that Kohberger was mentally unstable, they might be able to argue for a lesser charge or a reduced sentence. Psychological evaluations of Kohberger might be presented to the court in an attempt to explain his actions as a result of some form of mental illness or breakdown, providing grounds for his defense. As the trial progressed, the eyes of the world were on Moscow, Idaho. The brutal murders of 4 college students had shocked the nation, and the arrest of Brian Kohberger only deepened the mystery surrounding the case. The media had descended upon the small college town, broadcasting every detail of the proceedings, from the opening statements to the closing arguments. The trial was no longer just a local or national issue. It was an international spectacle. The global spotlight on the trial was immense. News outlets from around the world sent reporters to cover every aspect of the case, creating a media frenzy that added fuel to the already intense public interest. People around the globe were captivated by the twists and turns of the trial. Legal experts, psychologists, and criminologists were frequently interviewed on news programs, offering their opinions on the case and speculating on Kohberger's possible motives. Social media platforms exploded with discussions about the case. On Reddit, Twitter, and Facebook, users were quick to share their own theories about the murder, the evidence, and Kohberger's potential guilt. Speculation ran wild, with many suggesting that Kohberger had been fixated on the victims in a way that went beyond academic curiosity. Some even suggested that he had targeted them because they represented a certain type of college student, young, successful, and seemingly perfect. Others pointed to the idea that Kohberger might have been seeking notoriety, wanting to emulate the infamous criminals he had studied in his criminology classes. The public's thirst for details about the case led to an almost voyeuristic fascination with the trial. Every new piece of evidence or testimony was analyzed and reanalyzed. Kohberger's appearance in court, his behavior, and his interactions with his attorneys were scrutinized by the media and the public. People were eager to interpret every word, every gesture, and every movement as a clue to Kohberger's mental state and the truth behind the murders. For the victims' families, the trial was an emotional roller coaster. They watched as their loved ones' lives were dissected in the courtroom, their names and images becoming part of the legal narrative. At the same time, they hoped that the trial would bring closure, a sense of justice for the loss of their children and siblings. As the trial continued, it became evident that the questions surrounding Kohberger's motive, his actions, and his psychology were just as important as the evidence itself. The trial would not only determine his guilt or innocence, but also provide a deeper understanding of the mind of a criminology student accused of committing a horrific crime. As the trial of Bradley Kohberger moves forward, the question on everyone's mind is, why? What could possibly drive a young criminology student, someone who had studied the psychology of crime for years, to commit such a brutal and senseless act? And even as the evidence mounts, there remain unsettling gaps in the story, elements of the case that refuse to be fully explained. These unanswered questions continue to haunt both the victims' families and the public alike. Theories surrounding why Bradley Kohberger allegedly committed such a horrific crime are varied and remain speculative, with no definitive answers yet provided in court. As investigators continue to piece together the evidence, it becomes clear that the question of motive is at the heart of this complex case. Could Kohberger's interest in criminology, the study of crime, and the criminal mind have influenced his decision to commit such an act? Some have posited that Kohberger's academic background could have played a role in how he viewed criminal acts, perhaps even desensitizing him to the moral implications of murder. But does an academic fascination with crime provide any real insight into the mind of a killer? Psychological experts and criminologists have weighed in, offering their interpretations. Dr. X, a well-known forensic psychologist, suggests that Kohberger may have been experimenting with his newfound knowledge. It's possible that Kohberger viewed this as a way to test the theories he'd studied about criminal behavior, or perhaps he sought to emulate the very criminals he'd spent years analyzing. His understanding of criminal psychology may have emboldened him to believe that he could evade detection, further demonstrating the dangers of glorifying criminal behavior as a scientific study. Dr. X explained in an interview. Others believe there may have been a more personal or emotional trigger behind the killings. Kohberger's apparent obsession with the victims, particularly one or two of the female students, has been hinted at by investigators. His presence on social media, including Reddit threads where he seemed to study the behaviors of women and express his fascination with crime, raises questions about whether Kohberger was stalking the victims prior to the attack. Dr. Y, a forensic psychologist, speculated he may have fixated on the students, seeing them as an opportunity to put his theories into practice. There may have been an unspoken sense of power or control he sought to exert over his victims, especially given their proximity to his academic field. It's also worth considering the idea that Kohberger might have harbored some sense of resentment or anger toward the victims. Though there's no direct evidence to suggest he knew them personally, the proximity of the University of Idaho students to his own academic world raises the possibility that Kohberger may have viewed them as symbols of the life he longed for, or perhaps as people who reminded him of his own failings or feelings of inadequacy. Dr. Z, a criminologist with experience in studying serial crimes, said, "Many killers are motivated by a combination of personal frustrations and a desire to feel powerful. Kohberger may have sought to assert his dominance in a world where he felt overlooked or insignificant." However, this theory is complicated by the lack of a clear, identifiable connection between Kohberger and the victims. While some speculate about Kohberger's obsession, others wonder if there was an entirely different reason for the crime, a reason that has yet to surface in the trial. As with most high-profile cases, the public fascination surrounding Kohberger's trial has given rise to a variety of conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories in the case are varied and highly speculative, often circling around the idea that there is more to this crime than meets the eye. Some theories suggest that Kohberger may have been part of a larger organized group, perhaps a cult or network of like-minded individuals obsessed with crime. Though there is no concrete evidence to support these theories, they persist, especially in online forums and among true crime enthusiasts who often seek hidden explanations behind mysterious events. A particularly bizarre theory suggests that Kohberger may have been influenced by external forces, such as unknown third parties, or that the murders could have been the result of a larger revenge plot. These types of theories are often fueled by the public's desire for closure and their need to make sense of a senseless act. Could there be an unseen hand at work, guiding Kohberger toward this tragedy? Or is this just another case of overactive imagination, trying to place blame somewhere other than on the perpetrator himself? Another conspiracy that gained some traction early on was the claim that Kohberger's arrest was somehow manufactured. Some supporters of this theory believe that law enforcement intentionally framed him in order to close the case quickly. This theory, however, has been widely debunked by investigators who assert that the evidence against Kohberger is substantial and corroborated by multiple sources. Still, the existence of such theories speaks to the difficulty the public has in accepting the idea that someone seemingly ordinary could commit such a heinous crime. Despite the dismissal of many conspiracy theories, the mystery surrounding Kohberger's true motivations persists. Why would a criminology student with a promising future allegedly turn to murder? Could there be a deeper psychological issue at play, something that is yet to be fully understood? As the case unfolds, several unanswered questions continue to haunt the investigation. While Kohberger is the prime suspect, the details of his actions during the crime remain shrouded in mystery. How did he gain access to the victim's home? Despite initial claims of no forced entry, it is unclear whether Kohberger had some form of inside knowledge that allowed him to bypass security measures. The timeline of the murders and the exact sequence of events leading to the deaths is still being pieced together by law enforcement and forensic experts. The public continues to wonder whether there was more than one person involved, or whether Kohberger acted alone. Another ongoing mystery is the question of Kohberger's alibi during the critical moments of the crime. Although he was initially reported to have been in close proximity to the scene at the time of the murders, gaps in his exact whereabouts raise suspicions. Could there have been moments where his phone data was manipulated? Was he deliberately trying to throw investigators off his trail? Or was his presence near the crime scene simply a coincidence? These lingering questions keep the public guessing and law enforcement scrambling for answers. Finally, the psychological profile of Kohberger continues to be a focal point of public discourse. His years of study in criminology have led to endless speculation about what might have motivated him to commit such an act. Was it a cold, calculated decision? Or was he driven by something much deeper and more personal? And will the trial provide any insight into Kohberger's true motivations? Or will the mystery surrounding his actions remain unsolved, leaving us to ponder the mind of a man whose life seemed as enigmatic as the crime he stands accused of committing? As the trial moves forward and the evidence mounts, the public's hunger for answers remains as strong as ever. Theories and speculations will continue to circulate, but the truth, whether we are ready to accept it or not, will only come through the courts. And in the end, that truth may not bring the closure we so desperately seek. In the end, we may be left with as many questions as answers. As the trial against Bryan Kohberger progresses, the media and public have been keenly focused on psychological theories. The growing fascination with the psychology of criminals, particularly those who commit unspeakable acts of violence, brings a question that seems to haunt the entire case. What was Kohberger's true motivation? Was it simply a crime of opportunity, or was there something deeper, some underlying psychological driver that fueled such a brutal act? The evidence against Kohberger, his background in criminology, his potential obsession with the victims, compels us to delve further into the enigma of his psychology. Many experts, including psychologists and criminologists, have suggested that Kohberger may have had an intense psychological fascination with crime. Given his academic focus on criminal justice and the study of criminal behavior, Kohberger's potential desire to understand or experiment with criminality itself has been a recurring hypothesis. He may have seen the murders not as an impulsive act, but as a culmination of a long-standing obsession with understanding the psychology of violent offenders. This theory posits that Kohberger, given his deep immersion in criminology and criminal studies, might have wanted to test his theories in a very real and very dangerous way. But was it simply about knowledge for Kohberger? Was it merely about proving to himself or others that he could commit the perfect crime and escape detection, as some of his academic mentors might have taught in theory? The unsettling reality is that Kohberger may have believed that his studies in criminology gave him the tools to outsmart law enforcement, making him think that he could get away with murder, much like other criminals he studied. This brings us to another dark question. Was it about power? Power is a critical element in many criminal cases, especially when it comes to violent crimes. Some experts have suggested that Kohberger, perhaps feeling powerless or unnoticed in other areas of his life, may have committed these crimes as a way to assert control, not just over his victims, but over the world around him. After all, what greater way to feel powerful than to commit an act so shocking, so violent, that it sends waves of fear and confusion through an entire community? A significant mystery surrounding the case is whether Kohberger had any prior knowledge of the victims, whether this was a personal crime or one fueled by pure fascination. As investigators worked to build a case against him, it became apparent that there was no established connection between Kohberger and the victims, at least not in a way that was immediately visible. However, some have speculated that Kohberger's social media presence, particularly his engagement with various online forums and Reddit threads, might provide a clue to his state of mind. Could Kohberger have been watching the victims for some time, following their activities online? Was there any indication of him being involved in online conversations about the victims, or perhaps stalking them from a distance in a more passive way? While no direct evidence has emerged linking Kohberger to the victims' social media profiles, the question remains unresolved. Some believe that Kohberger, much like other criminals who meticulously plan their crimes, might have been seeking an opportunity to strike, waiting for the perfect moment when his victims were vulnerable. This theory raises unsettling questions about the possibility that the victims, particularly Kaylee Gonkovs and Madison Mogen, might have been the targets of a larger plan, one that involved not just the act of killing, but the meticulous stalking and targeting of individuals who seemed like ideal subjects for his twisted experiment. Others have pointed to the theory of obsessive behavior. Could Kohberger have been fixated on one or more of the victims for some time? A deep obsession rather than a rational, calculated plan. There is a dark possibility that Kohberger saw these women as objects of his desire. Objects that, in his twisted mind, had to be eliminated for reasons not yet fully understood. The case against Kohberger has ignited wild theories online, many of which have fueled further confusion and speculation. As is common in high-profile cases, particularly those involving unspeakable violence, the public has latched onto many potential explanations that are not supported by evidence, but which provide some form of comfort or satisfaction to those trying to make sense of the tragedy. One conspiracy theory that has gained traction is the possibility that Kohberger was not acting alone, but rather as part of a larger criminal network. Some speculators have suggested that Kohberger could have been under the influence of other individuals or groups who might have been involved in planning the murders, or at the very least had some knowledge of them. There is no evidence to support such claims, and law enforcement has firmly refuted these theories, stating that there is no indication Kohberger was connected to any group or organized crime. Yet the theory persists as people struggle to comprehend how someone who seemingly had no connection to the victims could be capable of such violence. Could Kohberger have been part of a larger criminal scheme that we haven't uncovered yet? Or was he simply a lone actor, driven by personal motives, psychological factors, and perhaps a twisted sense of intellectual superiority? Another theory that emerged in the aftermath of Kohberger's arrest was that he may have been involved in a long-standing obsession with violent crimes, beyond just the academic fascination with criminology. Some claim that Kohberger might have been attempting to emulate other notorious killers, viewing his actions as a way to prove himself or to gain recognition in the world of criminal behavior. While this theory is rooted in the idea that Kohberger was a copycat of sorts, it, too, lacks definitive support from the investigation, leaving the question open-ended for now. One conspiracy theory that has become notably widespread is the idea that the police have failed to uncover certain evidence that links Kohberger to the crime. Some claim that the timing of his arrest was too convenient, suggesting that it was a reaction to public pressure rather than the result of thorough investigation. This theory proposes that authorities may have been forced to make an arrest before they were ready, fearing the case would go cold without a suspect. However, law enforcement has vehemently denied this, asserting that the arrest was based on solid evidence, including DNA, cell phone data, and surveillance footage. Despite the official narrative, the internet has been rife with discussion and debate, and theories have flourished in online forums and on social media. In many ways, the case against Kohberger has become a spectacle, with every new development feeding into a wider narrative that often extends beyond the facts. People search for patterns, connections, and possible explanations, sometimes grasping at anything that feels like it could make sense of an otherwise incomprehensible tragedy. As the trial continues, there remain key pieces of the case that are still shrouded in mystery. The exact timeline of the night the murders occurred, for instance, remains a subject of considerable speculation. The question of when exactly Kohberger entered the house, whether he was inside the house before the victims returned home, or if he waited until they were asleep, is still uncertain. What we do know is that the attack occurred at night, in the early hours of November 13, 2022, but the precise sequence of events leading to the deaths of the 4 students remains unclear. Was there any struggle inside the house? Did Kohberger force the victims to comply, or were they caught completely off guard? Investigators have remained tight-lipped about the specifics of how the killings unfolded. The ambiguity of the circumstances only adds to the psychological tension that surrounds the case. Without clear answers to these fundamental questions, the mystery lingers, leaving room for endless speculation. Moreover, as the trial progresses, more details about Kohberger's personal history may come to light. But as of now, certain aspects of his past remain locked away, fueling further questions. Was Kohberger a loner or a social person? Did he have any significant relationships, or was he isolated, preferring the company of his own thoughts and theories? His history is somewhat clouded, with only fragments emerging, adding to the sense that something more complex lies beneath the surface. As the case unfolds and the trial edges closer to its conclusion, these lingering mysteries will continue to plague both the public and those involved in the investigation. Will we ever fully understand the reasons behind the brutal deaths of 4 promising young students, or will the answers remain locked away, hidden behind a wall of speculation, psychological complexity, and unprovable theories? One thing is certain: the shadow of this case will hang over Moscow, Idaho for years to come. As we reach the final chapters of this tragic story, we cannot help but pause and reflect on the profound loss that has shaken not only the families directly affected, but the community of Moscow, Idaho, and society at large. The murders of Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogan, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin have not simply taken 4 young lives. They have left an indelible scar that continues to reverberate throughout their families, their friends, and an entire university town. For Kaylee, Madison, Xana, and Ethan, the brutal events of that November night have become a permanent fixture in the lives of those who loved them. Each family has had to navigate the tremendous pain of losing someone they cherished, someone with a future full of promise, only to have it all stolen away in an act of violence that remains incomprehensible. Kaylee Goncalves was a beloved daughter, sister, and friend. Her family, Particularly her parents have spoken openly about the unbearable grief they have felt since the moment they were informed of her death. Her parents, Steve and Christy Goncalves, have bravely shared their sorrow with the public, expressing not only the devastation of losing their daughter, but the search for justice that has driven them every day. For them, Kaylee's death was not just the loss of a child, but the loss of someone who brought joy, light, and love into their lives. The pain of knowing that Kaylee's bright future was abruptly ended has haunted them throughout this process. Madison Mogen, too, was known for her warmth and vibrant personality. Her parents, Ben and Karen Mogen, have described their daughter as someone who brought people together with her kind heart and infectious smile. For them, the tragedy is compounded by the sheer unfairness of it all. Madison was on the brink of finishing her college journey, preparing for what could have been a life full of new experiences and success. Her parents, in their grief, have become vocal advocates for justice, tirelessly calling for accountability and demanding that the truth of what happened that night come to light. Xana Kernodle, a young woman with a passion for life and an eagerness to build her future, was also taken far too soon. Her family, including her mother and father, have shared the crushing weight of losing someone they had nurtured and watched grow into an adult with a world of potential ahead of her. The loss of Xana is a devastating blow to her loved ones, who now must navigate a future without her. Ethan Chapin, a bright and gentle soul, was an integral part of the community at the University of Idaho. His family, especially his twin sister, who was left to mourn without her other half, has spoken about the overwhelming grief of losing someone who was full of promise. Someone who could have contributed so much to the world. The Chapin family has shown immense strength throughout this journey, holding on to the memory of Ethan and fighting for the justice he deserves. As the families of the victims move through this painful process, their lives will forever be altered by the murders of their loved ones. In many ways, the journey to healing will never be complete. How could it be? The wounds are too deep. The losses are too great. But in the pursuit of justice, in the search for answers that might bring some semblance of closure, there is a sense that their loved ones' lives are not being forgotten. The quest for truth becomes, in a sense, a way of keeping their memories alive, of honoring the lives that were lost. The small, quiet town of Moscow, Idaho, which had always been a safe haven for students at the University of Idaho, was shattered by the events of that November night. Known for its peaceful environment and its close-knit community, Moscow now finds itself forever tied to the unspeakable tragedy that took place on King Road. For the residents of Moscow, the crimes marked a turning point. What was once a peaceful town, where students could walk the streets without fear, has now become a place marked by suspicion and unease. The shadow of the killings looms over the town, and many of its residents still carry the weight of the fear and uncertainty that gripped them in the months following the discovery of the bodies. The emotional toll on the community cannot be overstated. Students who once felt safe walking alone at night now find themselves constantly looking over their shoulders. Residents who never had to question their surroundings now find themselves wondering if anyone can truly be trusted. But amidst this sense of fear and sadness, there is also resilience. The town has come together in remarkable ways, with vigils, memorials, and a shared determination to make sure that the victims are never forgotten. As the investigation unfolded, Moscow's residents supported each other, and their sense of unity and solidarity in the face of this devastating tragedy was a testament to the strength of the community. Yet, the scars remain. This incident has left a permanent imprint on the town's collective consciousness. As the investigation continues and as the trial progresses, the emotional recovery for the community will take time, if it is even possible at all. The town will always bear the mark of that dark night, and it may never fully return to the innocent, idyllic place it once was. For Moscow, Idaho, the memory of these events will be forever intertwined with its identity. The case of Bradley Kohberger and the brutal murders of Kaylee, Madison, Xana, and Ethan has captured the attention of not just Idaho, but the entire nation, and, to some extent, the world. The media coverage, the trial, and the public's intense interest in the case have sparked important conversations about the nature of crime, justice, and how we understand criminal behavior. From the outset, this case raised several profound questions about the complexities of human nature. How can someone with a background in criminology, a field dedicated to understanding the causes and consequences of crime, commit such an act? What does this case say about the intersection of education, mental health, and criminal behavior? These are difficult questions that do not have easy answers, and they highlight a broader societal issue that we, as a society, must grapple with. The Kohberger case, much like other high-profile criminal cases, reminds us that violence can strike in the most unexpected ways. It challenges the idea that certain environments, such as academic institutions, are free from danger. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that sometimes even the people who seem most normal, most intelligent, and most trustworthy are capable of unspeakable acts. This case raises uncomfortable questions about how well we truly know those around us and how we should act when we feel that something is not quite right. On a broader level, this case is part of a growing conversation about the responsibility of the justice system, the media, and society as a whole in the wake of such tragedies. The quest for justice in a case like this is fraught with emotional complexity. How can we ensure that the legal system operates fairly and that the pursuit of justice does not become an endless cycle of speculation, but instead stays grounded in facts and evidence? How do we balance the need for closure with the demands of ensuring that every aspect of the case is thoroughly examined and understood? As the trial of Bradley Kohberger continues, it becomes evident that this case is not just about one man or a singular crime. It is about the pursuit of truth. It is about ensuring that the victims, Kaylee, Madison, Xana, and Ethan, are remembered for who they were, not just as victims, but as young people with futures. The trial is not just about securing a conviction, but about uncovering the truth of what happened on that night and ensuring that the full story is told. In the end, the pursuit of justice is more than just a legal process. It is an emotional journey for the families, the community, and everyone who has been touched by this tragedy. The memories of those who were lost should never fade into obscurity. Their families, their friends, and the people who loved them will continue to fight for justice and demand answers. And though no verdict, no amount of evidence can bring them back, it is the belief that justice will be served that helps in the healing process. For those of us following the case from the outside, it is crucial to remember that behind every headline, every trial update, and every analysis, there are real people, real lives that were shattered by violence. As we continue to witness the unfolding of this story, we must remain vigilant in our pursuit of the truth and keep the memory of the victims alive. Their story is not just about the crime that took their lives. It is about the lives they lived, the dreams they had, and the hope they shared with those around them. This case and the questions that remain unanswered will continue to haunt us for years to come. But in the end, it is the pursuit of justice for the victims, for their families, and for society that will shape the legacy of this tragedy. And as we reflect on this tragedy, we must remember one undeniable truth. The pursuit of truth and justice never stops. As we come to the end of this incredibly complex and heart-wrenching story, we turn to you, the viewers, to share your thoughts and opinions. The case of Bradley Kohberger and the tragic deaths of Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin continues to spark intense debates and speculations. Do you believe Bradley Kohberger is guilty of the murders? Or do you think there might be more to this story than meets the eye? Is there a possibility that we are missing something critical in the investigation? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. We want to hear what you think. We also want to remind you that your support means the world to us. If you found this story as compelling and thought-provoking as we did, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your engagement helps us bring you more in-depth, chilling, true crime stories like this one.